online event can be much easier than managing an in-person event. But it can also be unexpectedly complicated at the worst possible moments. Planning ahead can smooth away some of those difficulties and dodge the hidden traps. And Jaymes Farron will be talking about strategies and tactics for planning that online event. Jaymes.
Professional speakers know that when you go to a venue in physical venue, you're going to an event and you go up on that stage and you check everything out. You examine the mics, you figure out how to work with the slideshow presenters, you walk the floor of the stage, you don't know what we're going to trip over the wires, you do tech checks, and you bring backups with you for everything. This is important because things go wrong. In online events, that same level of preparedness is required of every single participant. Every single person who's going to be facilitating something, presenting something, doing something, needs to think ahead and plan ahead and do a lot of work to make sure it goes off without a hitch, because something always goes wrong. So if you plan ahead, you're able to have backups, you have margin, you'll be able to make things work anyway, even when things go wrong. So I'm going to be talking a bit about several different strategic level things and how they apply tactically to planning ahead and making things run when you are chairing an online event. After having worked with a bunch of different ones, I haven't run into every single conceivable thing that's gone wrong, but I've run into quite a few, and here are some things that give you the most bang for your buck as far as getting things fixed and working ahead of time. So, the first rule. How many of you are programmers and know what I mean when I say single source of truth? I won't go into details of exactly what that means for everybody because that could get involved quickly. But basically, in summation, if you have information, you want there to be only one place that actually exists for everybody. If you have two different sources of truth, where one person has one list, the other person has a different list, then one of those is going to get deviated, and there are going to be conflicts, and there's going to be miscommunications, and it's going to mess up like crazy. So here are some different kinds of things that we want to have as single sources of truth. The first one is a roster of everyone who has a role. This should be planned weeks in advance, if at all possible. And these should all be online. These should all be able to be shared to every single person, so they all have edit or view access, or at least comment access, so they can work with them, correct details, or ask questions as necessary. In your roster, you should have the name of every single person who has a role. I use Google Sheets. They work ideally for this. It's a spreadsheet, but it's stored online on the cloud. Have the name. If it has a weird pronunciation, include the pronunciation so somebody knows how to introduce them properly. What their preferred email is, not the one, if they have work versus personal, this works. They have both of them on there so they know which one to reach them by. Have the phone number that they use for calling and texting, so you can text them in the middle of the meeting if they lose track of where they are, they fall off or lose connection, you can still communicate with them. Have what time zone they're in. Also, who their backup is in their backup role, and all the same information for them. Have their public agenda managed the same way. Have it in a Google Doc. Just export that as a PDF and have that single source of truth be the actual editable virtual document. As well, particularly having a complex event, have a facilitator script. This is a lifesaver, particularly in contests. You have the timeline of everything that's happening, who is doing what, who is saying what, and then color coded by who is due, by which role everybody is doing. And then you have it all in a Google Doc. Again, it's not a file. Don't print it off. Please don't print it off, because then it won't get updated automatically. The full point of this is to have it all in one place online where everybody can access constantly the most recent updated version. Have that timeline that everybody can look at the same time. If something happens in the middle of a meeting where, oh my goodness, we need to move the Tiny Tech Moment till after the break, you can just adjust it in that facilitator script, everybody will know what's going on and everybody will go on without a hitch and not get confused about what's happening. Also, your registration list, have that located in one particular spot as well. Eventbrite is the one you want to use. Eventbrite is fantastic and amazing for tracking registration of things. Do not use Zoom registration. Do not. It is a pain. It does not have the functionality. It does not work as well as just having Eventbrite and then sending out the link to the Zoom meeting beforehand. Specifically for Toastmasters meetings, things like that, where you want to be able to send a link out to somebody who didn't register or because they missed it or something like that. You cannot do that if you have Zoom registration. They have to register or they cannot join the meeting. Also, you can't export the members, the attendees or the registrants as a CSV, which is necessary for being able to do a proper follow-up afterwards. Also, Facebook events, they allow registration. They have guest lists, that kind of stuff. Don't worry about that. Just link to the Eventbrite from the Facebook event. Have it all in one place so you don't have any conflicts. Like I said, when you're doing this, you want to have them all on Google. Have them stored in the cloud, not on separate files. Everybody's sending around where one person edits it and then sends that edited file and somebody else doesn't get sent the email or missed the email with the newer version, and then you end up with a bunch of different versions running around conflicting with each other. It does not work effectively. Have it all in stream, but you make sure that they can work with it and edit it. If you are at the top one up here, there we are. At the top one up here, I see the red X. Don't, if you're sharing something and you see that, it doesn't work. That means that you have to actually physically add them as owner to the actual sharing stuff, which is a little more complicated. You have to have their email and you have to have a Google account for that to work. Click the change to anyone with a link, and it'll look like we have on the bottom. There's another form where if you have your email address as part of like a company, like a Toastmasters professional email address or something like that, then you might run into issues where it's restricted only to people with that same email address. So make sure you have it linked like the bottom one here in order for them to actually be able to access it. Okay, next one. This is the next high-level strategy thing, is having dry runs. And this is all for the purpose of clarity. You want people to understand what's going to happen, what's happening at all points, and have clarity about every single stage. First thing you need to clarify is what technical features are going to be needed by whom. This is planning in advance so you know who's going to be the host, who's going to be the co-host, what permissions you need to set up in the meeting ahead of time in the settings on your the Zoom browser settings for the event ahead of time so that you can do what you want to do. For example, if you want to have your participants be able to do the whiteboard annotation along with the host or co-host, you have to give them permission to do that ahead of time on the website. Otherwise, it won't work. So if you want to do all that, you have to set it up ahead of time, set the settings. So talk with the people who you're planning, figure out whether you need breakout rooms for workshops, briefings, whether you need whiteboard annotation for attendees, whether people are going to use screen sharing, whether you should set that up as if everybody can screen share, whether you want to give specific permissions to that, whether you want to just allow anybody to do it, or whether you want to just give co-host permissions for them to have that access. Give permission to figure out who's going to record things and give permission to record, because people can't record just on their own. You have to give them direct permission to do that. Figure out if you're going to use polls. Set those up in advance. Polls editing in the middle of a Zoom meeting sucks. If you don't want to use built-in Zoom polls, which I would actually recommend you don't, set it up ahead of time in a Google Forms or something like that. Create the link, get ready to share. Have that ready ahead of time, what you need to set up. Chat. Decide ahead of time whether you want to have people only communicate with people, the hosts or the panelists if you're in webinar format, or things like that. I highly recommend getting everybody to have private conversations as well as public conversations like we have here. It's been proven to create more engagement and community awareness, to be able to actually have people love being part of your meeting. Also, clarify the details and capacities of each person. Make sure you have that roster up to date. Very critical. Also, get familiar with how tech savvy people are, because so if you realize that this person's really good, you can lean on them if you need debugging or something like that. If somebody's really new to stuff, know that you're probably going to need to send the person who's good at debugging over to help them out at some point. Get a feel for that. Get an idea of who's able to do what. Clarify the flow of transitions. This is something that I coach people with in giving speeches, actually. The hardest point in a speech is the transitions from one section to the next. The same thing happens in events. Who is introducing whom? And how are they doing that? What goes after what in the flow of things? Clarify who is going to introduce who and what happens in there. That creates a much more fluid meeting for everybody, creates a more professional atmosphere, and it creates ease and confidence for your guests. And again, just go through all the settings, clarify what is needed for all of them. Last bit of strategy, backups and margin. I am a firm and absolute believer in margin is the best thing you could ever do for mental health. Have margin everywhere. Fill your gas tank when it's half empty. Same thing happens for meetings. Have margin of roles. Have backups for the backups if you can, but when you have limited resources of people, have backups for all your main roles at least. So if they're not there, you can fill in. Margin of communication. Being able to have backup sources of communication. So texting with people, communicating on Discord, emailing with people, know how to get a hold of people if you lose track of them on Zoom or whatever your primary mode of communication is. Margin of deadlines, set things up with buffer around them. This applies also to margin of timelines. When you're planning out your meeting, make sure you have buffer in there. So when things go wrong or people go over time in their speeches, then you end up with things running over and things are going wrong. And so you need to have some margin in there so that things don't get completely screwed up. Margin saves the day. Summary, single sources of truth. Clarity creates agility. You're able to manage and react to things better when you have a higher degree of clarity. It makes things more flexible, ironically. And then margin, margin, margin. On everything, have margin on your margin. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how to have a smooth and effective event. No matter how complicated it is, following these rules will help. It'll mitigate most, if not all, of the minor, most common issues, and you'll be more prepared to handle the worst of them. So, thank you.
Game over.